It started by selling tea and spices. It ended up ruling a fifth of humanity. The most powerful corporation in history had its own army, its own navy, its own flag. And it conquered an entire subcontinent for profit. The East India Company. Before we go on, if stories like this are why you love history, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming. Think about the most powerful company you can name today. A tech giant, an oil company, a bank so big that governments bend to it. Now imagine a corporation so powerful that it didn't just influence a country, it conquered one. A company with its own army, its own navy, its own flag, and its own coins. A company that ruled over 200 million people, a fifth of the entire human race at the time. Not as a government, but as a business, answerable to its shareholders. This is not science fiction. It existed. And for the better part of a century, it was the most powerful corporation the world has ever seen. Its name was the East India Company. And this is the almost unbelievable story of how a group of London merchants, chasing profit, ended up conquering India. It began, as these things often do, with something small and ordinary. Greed, dressed up as opportunity. On the last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I of England signed a royal charter. It granted a group of London merchants a monopoly, the exclusive right to all English trade with the lands east of the southern tip of Africa, the distant, fabulously wealthy markets of Asia. They called themselves, grandly, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. History would know them, simply, as the East India Company. At the beginning, they were exactly what the name suggests: traders. Merchants. Their business was simple: sail halfway around the world in wooden ships, buy the treasures of the East, and bring them home to sell at enormous profit. And what treasures they were! From India and beyond came goods that Europe craved and could not produce itself. Spices, worth more than their weight in gold, fine cotton textiles and silk, indigo, the deep blue dye, saltpetre for gunpowder, porcelain, and of course tea, the drink that would become an obsession and eventually a national addiction in Britain. These goods flowed into British homes and transformed daily life. The very cup of tea that became the heart of British culture came from this trade, and the profits were staggering. The company's ships would return laden with cargo that could be sold for many times what it had cost, making its shareholders, the investors back in London, extraordinarily rich. But there was a problem. India in the 17th century was not some empty land waiting to be taken. It was home to one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations on Earth, the Mughal Empire. At its height, the Mughal Empire was staggeringly wealthy. By some estimates, it accounted for nearly a quarter of the entire world's economic output. Its emperors ruled in a splendor that made European kings look poor. Its cities were vast, its craftsmen unrivaled, its armies enormous. So when these English merchants first arrived, they came not as conquerors, but as humble petitioners. They came begging for permission, for the right to build a trading post, a warehouse, a foothold on the coast. And the mighty Mughals, secure in their power, granted these strange foreigners a few coastal enclaves to conduct their trade. Places that would grow into great cities: Madras, Bombay, Calcutta. For decades, this was the arrangement. The company traded. It grew rich. But it remained, fundamentally, a guest in someone else's empire, a small commercial operation clinging to the edges of a giant. So how did the guest become the master? How did a trading company end up ruling the very empire it had once begged for scraps from? The answer lies in a slow, fateful shift, and it began with the need to protect the profits. Trading in a distant and increasingly unstable land was dangerous. There were rivals, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and above all the French, all competing viciously for the same trade. There were pirates. And as the once mighty Mughal Empire began in the 18th century to weaken and fracture, India became a patchwork of regional rulers, ambitious governors, and shifting alliances, a landscape of opportunity and danger. To protect its trading posts and its cargo, the company began to do something that would change everything. It began to raise its own soldiers. At first, it was just guards, security for the warehouses. But over time, that force grew. And crucially, the company discovered it could recruit local Indian soldiers, men known as sepoys, train them in European methods of warfare and discipline, arm them with modern muskets, and command them with British officers. This was the key that unlocked everything. The company didn't need to ship huge armies from Britain. It could raise a vast army in India itself, from the Indian population, and pay for it with the profits of trade. A trading company was growing fangs. And then came the moment that transformed the company from a merchant into a monster. It came in the rich northeastern province of Bengal, the wealthiest region in all of India, and it centered on one of the most consequential and most cynical battles in world history, the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The ruler of Bengal, the Nawab, had grown alarmed and angry at the company's growing power and its abuses of the trade privileges it had been granted. He moved against them. And so the company's forces, led by a former clerk turned soldier named Robert Clive, faced the Nawab's army on a field at Plassey. On paper, it should have been a slaughter of the British. The Nawab commanded an army of around 50,000 men. Clive had roughly 3,000. But the battle was not won with muskets. It was won with money. Because before the battle, Clive had done something far more powerful than outfighting his enemy. He had secretly bribed the Nawab's own top general, a man named Mir Jafar, promising to make him the new ruler of Bengal if he would betray his master. And so, at the crucial moment, as the two armies met, Mir Jafar and a huge portion of the Nawab's army simply stood still. They did not fight. The betrayal shattered the Nawab's forces, and the company won a stunning victory, losing only a couple of dozen men. The Battle of Plassey was, in the end, barely a battle at all. It was a corporate takeover, executed with a bribe and a betrayal, and its consequences were earth-shaking. The company installed the traitor Mir Jafar as its puppet ruler of Bengal, and Robert Clive walked into the treasury of Bengal, one of the richest treasuries in the world, and helped himself. He took a personal fortune worth, in today's money, tens of millions of pounds, carried down the river on a fleet of boats. A single man, made almost unimaginably rich in a single stroke by looting a province. But the far greater prize was not the gold in the treasury. It was what came a few years later, in 1765. The company forced the Mughal emperor, now a shadow of his former power, to grant it the Diwani, the legal right to collect all the taxes of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Tens of millions of people. Stop and consider what this meant. A private trading company, run from an office in London, now had the legal right to tax an entire nation. It was no longer just a business. It had become a government, a ruler of millions, collecting revenue by force from a vast population. And this is where the true horror of the machine reveals itself, because the company had discovered a self-perpetuating engine of conquest. It could use the tax revenue squeezed from the people of Bengal to pay for a bigger army, and it could use that bigger army to conquer more territory, and that new territory would yield more tax revenue to pay for an even bigger army to conquer even more. Trade, army, conquest, tax, a bigger army, more conquest. Round and round, the engine turned, and the company grew and grew, swallowing kingdom after kingdom across the Indian subcontinent. And the army that engine produced was staggering. At its peak, the private army of the East India Company, a single corporation, numbered around 250,000 soldiers. By some counts, it swelled to over 300,000. That is roughly twice the size of the entire British National Army at the time. Let that sink in. A company had a private military force twice as large as the Army of Great Britain itself, and the vast majority of those soldiers, perhaps 7 out of every 8, were not British at all. They were Indian sepoys, fighting and dying to conquer their own subcontinent for the profit of shareholders on the other side of the world. With this force, over the following decades, the company brought more and more of India under its control. Some ruled directly, some through puppet princes who did as they were told. It fought wars against Indian kingdoms, against the French, against anyone who stood in the way of profit. It defeated the powerful kingdom of Mysore. It broke the Maratha Confederacy. It forced the once mighty Mughal emperor himself to become little more than a pensioner under company protection. By the early 19th century, the transformation was complete. The humble trading company that had once begged for a warehouse on the coast now ruled, directly or indirectly, almost the entire Indian subcontinent, modern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma. 200 million people, a fifth of the world's population, governed by a corporation. And what kind of ruler was this corporation? We must be honest, because the answer is dark. The East India Company was not built to govern for the good of the people it ruled. It was built to make a profit for its shareholders, and everything it did in India was bent toward that single purpose. The result was, in many cases, catastrophic exploitation. The company squeezed the population for every possible penny in taxes. It manipulated agriculture and trade for its own gain. And in 1770, just a few years after it took control of Bengal's revenues, that province was struck by a horrifying famine. The famine had natural causes: a failed monsoon, drought. But the company's policies made it immeasurably worse. It continued to demand its full, brutal taxes, even as people starved. It had done nothing to store grain against disaster, focused as it was on revenue. Some of its officials even profited by hoarding rice and selling it at monstrous prices as people died. The result was one of the worst catastrophes of the age. It is estimated that around 10 million people, perhaps a third of the entire population of Bengal, died in that famine. 10 million people, a number almost too large to comprehend. It stands as a horrifying monument to what happens when the government of a nation is handed to an institution whose only true loyalty is to profit. And here is a bitter irony that people at the time noticed too. While Bengal starved, the company's shareholders in London grew richer, and its senior officials returned home from India with vast, obscene fortunes. These men were nicknamed, mockingly, the nabobs, flaunting their Indian wealth, buying up grand English estates and seats in Parliament. Even in Britain, many were disgusted by the greed and the corruption. Robert Clive himself was hauled before Parliament to answer for his conduct and his enormous fortune. For a time, The company seemed unstoppable. A state within a state, a business more powerful than most kingdoms on earth. But an institution built on exploitation and force was always going to face a reckoning. And that reckoning came in 1857. The spark, famously, was a rumor among the company's own Indian soldiers, the sepoys on whom its entire power rested. A new rifle had been issued, and its cartridges had to be bitten open. The rumor spread that these cartridges were greased with the fat of cows and pigs, an outrage to the deepest religious beliefs of both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, defiling to both. To the sepoys, it felt like a deliberate insult, the final straw atop years of grievance against their arrogant foreign masters. But the cartridges were only the trigger. The real cause was a century of resentment against the exploitation, the arrogance, the endless taxation, the destruction of old ways of life, the sheer humiliation of being ruled by a foreign company. And in 1857, it exploded. The sepoys rose in mutiny, and the revolt spread like wildfire across northern and central India, drawing in not just soldiers, but princes, peasants, and ordinary people with 100 grievances of their own. It became a vast and bloody uprising against company rule, one that Indians would come to remember as the first great war for their independence. The fighting was brutal, and the reprisals, when the company and British forces regained control, were savage. The rebellion was, in the end, crushed. But it had shattered something permanently, because it had made one thing undeniable to the British government back in London. A private company had no business ruling a subcontinent of 200 million people. The whole arrangement was revealed as monstrous, unstable, and indefensible. And so, in 1858, the British government did what it should perhaps have done long before. It abolished the rule of the East India Company. The Government of India Act stripped the company of all its territories, all its powers, and its vast army, and transferred everything directly to the British Crown. India would now be ruled directly by the British government, the beginning of what became known as the British Raj. The most powerful corporation in the history of the world had been nationalized out of existence. Stripped of its empire, the company lingered on for a few more years as a shadow of itself before being formally dissolved in 1874. It ended not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of an office. But its legacy did not end. Its conquest set the shape of British India, and the consequences of that, for India, for Britain, for the world, echoed across the next 2 centuries and beyond. So what are we to make of the East India Company? It is, in one sense, one of the most astonishing stories in all of history, a tale of how a small band of merchants, driven by nothing more than the pursuit of profit, ended up building an empire and ruling 1/5 of the human race. It is a story of audacity, of cunning, of world-changing ambition. But it is also a warning. It is the story of what can happen when an institution is given enormous power, but is accountable to no one but its own shareholders. When the pursuit of profit is allowed to override every other consideration, including the lives of millions. The East India Company was not evil in some cartoonish way. It was something more unsettling. It was a machine, built to make money, that grew so powerful it consumed a subcontinent and left famine and conquest in its wake, all recorded neatly in the ledgers as the cost of doing business. It began with a cup of tea. It ended with an empire. And it remains to this day the most powerful company that has ever existed, a reminder of what commerce, unchecked, is capable of becoming. The East India Company remains a warning that when profit answers to no one, even a business can consume a subcontinent, and call it the cost of doing business.